Republican Senator Lindsey Graham has died. His office says he passed away following a brief and sudden illness. In a Truth Social post, President Donald Trump called Graham one of the greatest people and senators he has ever known.
A president who almost never lets his voice crack picked up the phone to a national television audience, and for a few unscripted seconds, sounded like a man who had lost his footing. It wasn't a policy fight or a campaign attack that did it. It was a phone call. A ordinary, forgettable phone call that instantly became the last conversation he would ever have with one of his closest friends in Washington. That friend was Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, and on the Saturday night he died, nobody around him, least of all the president, had any idea the clock had already started running out. Trump had spoken to Graham only hours before the senator was rushed to the hospital, and when he went on air the next morning, he couldn't stop circling back to it. He told the host it might have been Graham's final call. He said he didn't know for certain, only that sometime around 1 in the morning a message arrived from someone in Graham's office saying the senator was gone, and that the news left him struggling to process what he was hearing. For a man built almost entirely out of certainty and swagger, that admission landed differently. It sounded like grief with nowhere to hide. To understand why that call shook him so badly, you have to go back roughly 24 hours to a version of Lindsey Graham who looked like the last person on earth anyone would expect to lose. On the Friday before he died, Graham was standing in Kiev, in the middle of an active war zone, on what was reportedly his 10th trip to Ukraine since the full-scale Russian invasion began. He met with President Zelensky. He toured facilities connected to Ukraine's drone program and talked with visible enthusiasm about what he'd seen, arguing that the United States had real reason to partner with Ukrainian engineers who had learned, out of sheer necessity, how to out-innovate a much larger enemy. He also delivered what he clearly believed was a genuine turning point. Word that the White House had come around on a long-stalled package of sanctions aimed at squeezing the countries still propping up Russia's war machine. A bill some allies had taken to calling one of the toughest sanctions measures in years. Graham told reporters he had never felt more optimistic that the war might actually have a path to an end. Anyone who had followed Graham's career for more than a few years would recognize that scene instantly. This was a man who had built his entire political identity around showing up in dangerous places most senators never bothered to visit. Over roughly a decade of war in Ukraine, he had made the trip again and again, sometimes alongside colleagues, sometimes practically alone, meeting with soldiers, touring damaged infrastructure, and coming home to lobby anyone who would listen for more weapons, more funding, and more pressure on Moscow. Friday's trip fit that same pattern. He wasn't there for a photo opportunity. He was there because, by his own account, he believed the pieces were finally falling into place for something real. A genuine off-ramp from the war he'd spent years trying to help end. He then flew home across the Atlantic, landed in Washington, and did what Lindsey Graham always did after a long trip. He got straight back to work. That evening he called the president, not to talk about his health or his flight or how exhausted he must have been, but to push yet another piece of legislation, the Save America Act, an election security bill he'd been fighting for. According to Trump, Graham told him they were all set, that the votes were coming together, and that he'd been pushing the bill relentlessly. Trump would later say Graham sounded a little tired from the travel, but otherwise entirely like himself. They even talked about possibly meeting up the next day. Then they hung up. Neither man had any reason to think it was goodbye. It's worth sitting with just how ordinary that call was. There was no long goodbye. No final piece of wisdom passed down, none of the things people imagine when they picture a last conversation with someone they love. It was two men talking about vote counts and legislative strategy, the exact kind of transactional, work-focused exchange the two of them had probably had 1,000 times before. That ordinariness is part of what seemed to hit the president so hard afterward. There was nothing in the tone of that call to suggest anything was wrong, nothing that, in hindsight, offered any kind of warning. Graham was, by every account given afterward, thinking about legislation and elections and the war in Ukraine right up until the very end, not about his own mortality. Later that Saturday evening, emergency crews were called to Graham's home on Capitol Hill. What began as a report of chest pain escalated quickly. Paramedics arrived, began treatment, and Graham was taken by ambulance to George Washington University Hospital, the same hospital that has treated more than one member of Congress in a crisis. Neighbors reportedly watched the scene unfold from their windows as police cars and fire trucks filled the street. Despite the effort to save him, Graham died that night. He was 71 years old. His office released a short, careful statement in the early hours of Sunday morning, saying only that the senator had passed away from what it called a brief and sudden illness, and asking for prayers and privacy during what it described as an incredibly difficult period. There was no detailed explanation attached to it, which is often exactly the kind of vacuum that lets speculation take over before facts can catch up. In the days that followed, Graham's office and the D.C. Medical Examiner's Office indicated that preliminary findings pointed to an aortic dissection, a tear in the body's main artery, brought on by underlying cardiovascular disease. It's a condition that can turn from bearable to catastrophic within minutes, which lines up painfully well with how quickly Graham went from sounding like himself on the phone to being gone. Because he died so suddenly, and because of who he was, it didn't take long for darker theories to spread across social media. Graham had spent years as one of the loudest American voices calling for Russia to be squeezed with sanctions and for Ukraine to be armed. He had just walked out of a war zone less than 2 days before his death. To some corners of the internet, that timing felt too convenient to be a coincidence, and questions about foul play, poisoning, or retaliation started circulating almost immediately. It's an understandable impulse. When someone that prominent, that healthy looking on camera, drops dead within 48 hours of standing in the middle of a war he'd spent years trying to influence, people go looking for a story that makes sense of it. But nothing in the reporting around Graham's death has pointed to anything other than a natural, if devastating, medical event rooted in his own cardiovascular health. And it's worth being careful about repeating unverified claims as though they were established fact. Grief doesn't need a conspiracy to be worth taking seriously, and neither does his death. If there's a quieter and sadder explanation, it may be sitting inside his own family history. Graham's father died of heart-related illness in his late 60s. Long before Saturday night, Graham had lived with that inheritance hanging over him, the kind of thing families rarely talk about out loud until it's too late to matter. And that family history connects to something a lot of people never fully knew about Lindsey Graham the person, as opposed to Lindsey Graham the senator. For all the tributes, all the flags lowered to half-staff, all the statements from world leaders, the people who might have grieved him hardest in a traditional sense, a spouse, children of his own, never existed. Graham never married and never had kids. That wasn't an accident of circumstance, so much as the direct result of what happened to him as a very young man. When Graham was in his early 20s, his mother died of cancer. Roughly a year later, his father died as well, leaving Graham and his teenage sister suddenly alone, with a small family business to somehow keep afloat in their hometown. Instead of walking away from that responsibility, Graham stepped fully into it. He took on legal responsibility for his sister, worked to make sure she had access to the support and benefits she needed, and made the drive home again and again to hold what was left of the family together. People who knew them both have described him, in essence, as having been brother, father, and mother to her all at once during those years. It's a kind of story that rarely makes it into a political profile, but it explains a great deal about the man underneath the title. For decades, people speculated publicly about why Graham never settled down, and he tended to answer with a joke rather than an explanation, saying something to the effect that he never found the time to meet the right woman, and that the right woman probably had the good sense not to make time for him either. It was funny, and it was also a fairly transparent way of deflecting a much heavier truth, that so much of his capacity for that kind of close, protective love had already been spent on the sister he raised. Understanding that history changes how it lands when a president says, on live television, that this man felt like family to him. It also helps explain something people who covered Graham for years often noted, which is how much of his emotional life seemed to get funneled into his professional relationships instead of a household of his own. Colleagues became something closer to an extended family. Staffers who worked for him for decades were treated less like employees and more like people he was personally responsible for. Foreign leaders he'd met on repeated trips overseas, including Ukrainian officials he'd built relationships with over years of visits, spoke about him with a warmth that goes beyond typical diplomatic courtesy. When you don't have a spouse or children to come home to, that kind of loyalty and attachment doesn't just disappear. It gets redirected. And in Graham's case, it seems to have been redirected almost entirely into public service and the people he worked alongside. Which brings us to the strange, complicated arc of Trump and Graham's relationship, because it did not start anywhere close to friendship. Back in 2015, during the early days of Trump's first presidential run, Graham was one of his harshest Republican critics, describing him in blunt and unflattering terms and warning that nominating him would be disastrous for the party. After the events at the Capitol in January of 2021, Graham again distanced himself publicly, saying at the time that he was done, that enough was enough. If you only knew those two moments, you'd assume these were two men who would never be caught within 10 feet of each other again. Instead, over the years that followed, Graham became one of Trump's most visible defenders in the Senate. He turned into a regular golfing partner, someone who joked publicly about never quite managing to beat the president on the course, and he leaned into a role as an informal advisor on foreign policy, at times describing himself as something like Trump's compass on the subject. It's a strange transformation to watch unfold in real time. A man who once called Trump dangerous for the party becoming one of the people the president leaned on most. That's part of why the reaction to Graham's death crossed so many political lines. Democrats, who had fought him hard for years over immigration, judicial nominations, and foreign policy, still turned out to mourn him, several describing him as a fierce opponent, but also someone genuinely likable, someone who could disagree with you all day and still shake your hand at the end of it. That combination, sharp-elbowed political fighter and personally warm colleague, is a rare thing to pull off in modern Washington. And it's a large part of why his death didn't just register inside his own party. Even people who had clashed with him for years, including plenty of commentators and lawmakers who spent the Trump era criticizing Graham's political transformation, paused to acknowledge that whatever you thought of his politics, the man himself was hard not to like on some level. That's a strange kind of legacy for a career politician to leave behind, more remembered in the end for how he made people feel across the aisle than for any single piece of legislation. It says something about Washington, too, that in an era defined by bitter partisanship, one of the more universally mourned figures was a man who spent his career switching sides, softening old grudges, and building relationships that outlasted the disagreements that started them. Perhaps the most bittersweet part of this story is the work Graham left unfinished. For more than a year, he had been the driving force behind that aggressive Russia sanctions package. The one he just told reporters in Kyiv was finally moving with White House support. He died believing he'd won that fight, without ever getting to see the actual vote. In the aftermath, lawmakers from both parties who worked with him on the bill have talked about pushing it across the finish line, specifically as a way of honoring him, which means his final piece of legislation may become law only after he's no longer here to see it happen. There's also the Save America Act, the very bill he was pushing in that last phone call with the president, now carrying an entirely different emotional weight for the people trying to move it forward. Then there's the practical reality his death leaves behind. Graham had just won his primary weeks earlier and was actively campaigning for another term representing South Carolina, a seat he had held for more than 2 decades. His sudden absence means the state now has to work through the process of filling that seat, with multiple potential candidates already being discussed, and an eventual special election to determine who serves out the remainder of his term. South Carolina's governor summed up the loss simply, saying the state wouldn't see someone like him again. That kind of sudden vacancy sends ripples through more than just one state's political map. Graham had spent years accumulating seniority, chairing a major Senate committee, and building relationships across the aisle and across the world that simply can't be handed off to a successor overnight. Whoever eventually takes his seat inherits the title, but not the decades of relationships, the trust built with foreign leaders during a dozen wartime visits, or the institutional memory of a man who had served in the chamber for more than 20 years. In the short term, his absence also complicates an already narrow Republican majority, at a moment when several other senators have shown a willingness to break from the party line. Losing a reliable, experienced voice like his, however unpredictable he could sometimes be, changes the math in ways that go well beyond sentiment. Maybe that's the real story sitting underneath all the noise from that Sunday morning, underneath the shaky voice on live television and the replayed phone call and the online arguments about what really happened. Not a conspiracy, not a hidden plot, just an ordinary Saturday evening that turned, in the space of a single phone call and a single ambulance ride, into the end of a 20-year career and a friendship that had somehow survived a decade of insults, disagreements, and eventual loyalty. The loudest man in the Senate went quiet in the space of a few hours, and the people who loved him across party lines, in a war zone thousands of miles away, and in the Oval Office itself, were left trying to make sense of how a day that began with so much promise could end the way it did. What do you think really explains a moment like this, the simple and painful truth of a sudden illness? Or is there more to the story than the public has been told? Leave your thoughts in the comments below.